This lesson begins study of the books of Samuel. There's 2 books. The first one focuses on the prophet Samuel and the first 2 kings of Israel, Saul and David. And in this lesson today, we'll cover from Samuel's birth to Saul's downfall. Excuse me. The account of the prophet Samuel begins with Elkanah and his 2 wives. Not surprisingly, the 2 wives don't get along because one is fertile and the other is barren. We can assume there was always competition among wives in polygamy, which is why it's such a bad idea for anyone to have more than one spouse. But as always, God works through and around people's poor judgment and character flaws and social institutions. So every year, Elkanah would take his family to Shiloh to worship God, which is where we're introduced to the 2 sons of Eli the priest, Hophni and Phinehas. At least that's how I've always heard it pronounced. But remember those names, they'll come up again later. But though Elkanah tries to pacify the barren wife, Hannah, with double portions of food since he loved her the most, and we all know how that sort of thing has worked out in Israel's history, she's still miserable because the fertile wife keeps mocking her for being childless. And the husband just doesn't get it, of course, but on one such trip to Shiloh, Hannah weeps bitterly to God about this, and she vows to God that if he gives her a child, she'll dedicate him to God in a similar way that Samson was, who never drank wine or cut his hair. But she's praying in her heart and only moving her lips, and so Eli the priest sees her and presumes that she's drunk. So she explains that she's just crying out to God in anguish, and then he hopes that God grants her request. So she and the rest of the family go home, and after that time, God grants her prayer, and then later she gives birth to Samuel. But when the time comes to return to Shiloh, Hannah remains behind to finish weaning him, and then she will take him there to Shiloh to stay permanently in God's service. Now, down in, let's see, that was around verse 19 when we got to that part. So now we're going to go to chapter 2. Sorry, I forgot to scroll the screen while I was reading through that. And this prayer is here, and this is pretty much a taunt against Hannah's rival wife, seeing that it's all about humiliating the proud and elevating the humiliated. This is how God works, the opposite of society's norms. So God is once again choosing the lowly and despised. And then down in verse 12, we see that the narrative turns briefly to Eli's 2 wicked sons who were abusing their positions as priests. And then down in verse 18, it turns back to Samuel, whose mother would bring him new clothes every year when they all came to sacrifice. And Eli pronounces a blessing on Hannah for God to give her more children because she honored her vow and gave him up. He was her firstborn. And so God does. And then in verse 22, it's back to Eli's wicked sons, who not only have been robbing people's sacrifices, but also, at least in the Hebrew text, they were sexually assaulting the women who served at the temple. Eli was old and didn't even know what his sons were doing until other people told him. And God, at this point, has already decided that the sons will die for their wickedness. So now let's go down to verse 27. And God sends someone to confront Eli about his failure to discipline his sons after he was told, which meant he was valuing them more than God. So God curses Eli with premature death on all his descendants, beginning with the deaths of both his sons on the same day. On top of that, his descendants will, from then on, forever beg crumbs from the family of the one God will raise up to replace him. Meanwhile, we come down to chapter 3. Samuel grows up and has a reputation of being a godly man, though messages from God had become rare by then. And one night, Samuel hears a voice calling to him, so he assumes it's Eli and goes to see what he wants. But Eli just tells him to go back to sleep, and then it happens again. But by the 3rd time, Eli finally realizes that Samuel is being called by God. So he tells him how to respond the next time God speaks to him. And down in verse 11, God gives him a message that is basically repeating the curse on Eli and his family line. But Samuel is afraid to tell him, so he just waits till morning, and then, of course, Eli demands to know what he was told. And though the curse did not take place that very day, Samuel was becoming known through Israel as a prophet of God, and it was just going to be a matter of time. So then down in chapter 4, the curse is starting with the Philistines, a familiar name from our study of Samson. And they go to battle with the Israelites and begin to defeat them. So the Israelites decide to bring the Ark of the Covenant to the battlefield. And that also meant that Eli's sons would go with it. So God is working behind the scenes. But down in verse 5, it's obvious that bringing the ark out to the battlefield doesn't do Israel any good, as if the ark could be used as a talisman. A talisman was kind of like a magic charm that various religions would use and societies would use to bring them good luck. And that's how Israel was using the ark, not as it was meant to be. So it's captured by the Philistines, and Eli's sons are killed in battle. So stage 1 of the curse is complete. Then down in verse 12, what goes a little too far to sometimes. Meanwhile, Eli has been sitting in a chair by the road waiting to find out the fate of the ark, but apparently not his sons. He's always concerned about the ark and not so much about his own children. When a runner comes with news of the battle, and after telling him about his sons and the ark, Eli falls backward, especially at the news of the ark, falls backward off his chair and breaks his neck, and so he died the same day as his sons. When one of his daughters-in-law heard about this, as we can see down in verse 19, she goes into labor and gives birth to a son, and then she dies. So it's all unraveling in a hurry. And then down in chapter 5, meanwhile, the Philistines, depending on how I've heard it pronounced both ways, had taken the ark to the temple of their god Dagon. But the next morning, the idol was face down on the ground before the ark. They stood it up again, but the day after that, not only was the idol on the ground again, but its head and hands were chopped off as well. You would think they'd take the hint about false gods, but instead they just moved the ark to another place. But down in verse 8, we can see that sores break out on the people in the city where they took the ark, so the ark gets moved again, but the people there aren't dumb enough to accept it. So it's moved again, and after 6 months of this, if we come to chapter 6, after 7 months of this, rather, they consult their soothsayers to find out how to get Israel to take it back. They don't even want it anymore. Their advice includes familiarity with what God had done to Egypt. So this was well known. And along with that, they consider that they must bring a proper guilt offering. So they send all this stuff they send the ark and the offerings in a cart and let 2 cows just wander off and pull it wherever they choose. And then the soothsayers have decided that which way the cows decide to go will determine their actions, whether this was all really God's doing or just a bunch of bad coincidences. So down in verse 16, we see that the cows have pulled the cart to a certain field in Israel, so they have determined that this was from God. But some of the locals are killed because they look inside the ark. So they send for others to come and take the ark away, as if this is like a high-stakes game of hot potato. This poor ark is getting sent all over the place. And down in chapter 7, it stays in the next place for 20 years. And then Samuel tells Israel that they have to get rid of all their idols and shrines so they can be delivered from the Philistines. But now let's go down to verse 7. And the Philistines see all Israel gathered together, getting rid of their false gods and everything, and so they decide that this is a good chance to attack. But from the description there, it's basically like God just says boo at them and causes them to panic, and this allows Israel to defeat them. So from then on, as long as Samuel lived, Israel was not bothered again by the Philistines. Until Saul starts doing stupid things again, which he seems to have a habit of doing. But when Samuel is old, he appoints his son as judges over Israel. But as with Eli, Samuel's sons turn out to be wicked. And it is this which prompts Israel to demand a king. So consequences. And this was never God's intention. So Samuel failed to learn from the poor example of his mentor, and this is just the natural consequence of these things. And this is, again, the backdrop of why Israel demanded a king. Then we go down to verse 7. And when Samuel tells God about all this that's going on, about their request for a king, God informs him that it isn't Samuel the people are really rejecting, it's God. So he tells Samuel to give the people fair warning of what it means to have a human king over them. The sons will be conscripted into the army, the daughters will be pressed into service as cooks, the farmers will be ordered to grow the king's food and tend his herds, The craftsmen will be ordered to make weapons, and the landowners will be taxed for the benefit of the king's officials, his favorites. Human government is inherently oppressive, and God is warning people about that. But, as we can see in verse 18, that's a little too far there, even with this final warning that God will turn a deaf ear to them when they whine about being oppressed by their own king, they still demand it, because they want to be like all the other nations. This is just as foolish as when Christians today demand to be under the laws of Moses, giving up the better for the lesser. So now in chapter 9, now the search is on for a king, and naturally they pick the son of a prominent man. Saul, who is described as being head and shoulders taller than the average man, was off chasing after some of his father's escaped donkeys when he comes to a town where Samuel is planning to make a sacrifice. And then we see down in verse 14 that Samuel is told by God that this guy he'd encounter the next day would be the one to anoint his king. And when he meets him, Saul, just like Gideon, wonders why someone from a small tribe in Benjamin is to be given a message from God. But instead of telling him outright, as we see here in verse 22, Samuel invites him to dinner and then tells him just before he sends him back to his father that he has this message. So, starting chapter 10, Samuel anoints Saul with oil and pronounces that he will be king of Israel, which will ultimately not really be proved to the whole nation until he leads a battle successfully against the Philistines. But then down in verse 6, Samuel tells Saul that the Spirit of God will come upon him at a certain place, and this will cause him to prophesy and change him into a different person. So here's a clear instance of the fact that the Holy Spirit in these times came and went on individuals. This is all before the cross. Came and went, and only on certain individuals, in contrast to the permanent indwelling of the Spirit after the cross. So just to keep that in mind. And then in verse 9, these things all come true as Samuel prophesied, and people who had known Saul began to wonder what happened to him, because he had an obvious change of personality. And shouldn't that be said of all people who become Christians as adults? It probably should, but unless they were really pretty good people before that, so we have to consider that. Sometimes it's illustrated like if there's a vast field divided in half by a fence, and as you go away from the middle where the fence is, the terrain gets very different. And so if you cross from one field to the other, how different it seems depends on how far away you were from the fence. And so it is with people being quote-unquote saved that a person who was very wicked will notice a much bigger, obvious change in their habit and their life than someone who was pretty good to begin with by anybody's observable standards. So then down in verse 16, finally Samuel gathers everyone together to tell them that they finally had their precious king instead of direct rule by the God who had rescued them from Egypt. So guilt trip. And it seems clear from this choice of Saul that God is going to teach them a lesson. But as we can see down in verse 21, when it comes time to present Saul to them, he had hid himself in fear. This is their king. They had to drag him out of hiding, which should have been their first clue that this demand of theirs was a bad idea. But no, in spite of having to drag him out of hiding, they all shout, "Long live the king," like prisoners cheering a new cowardly warden. It makes no sense, but that's what people do, and they don't learn from other people's mistakes. So down in verse 8 of chapter 11, I think that's where I wanted to go, unless I had the wrong thing here. I think I've got it right. That Samuel's first battle as king is to wipe out the army of the Ammonites who were threatening them, and after the battle they celebrate by formally establishing him as a king. But then, back to Samuel, who is near the end of his life, we see in chapter 12 that he recounts the pathetic history of Israel's cycle of rebellion, oppression, and restoration. But God will be with them anyway if they follow him, in spite of demanding this king. But if not, and really when not, they will be punished again. So the same thing, lather, rinse, repeat from Israel's history. This is just another round of that. And then chapter 13, we see that this king they just coronated provokes the Philistines. The first thing he does. as if he had a stick in his hand and couldn't resist striking a hornet's nest with it. So now he's confronted by an army much larger than his own, so he does what he's best at, hide in a cave and call for help. And then in verse 9, he sends for Samuel, but gets impatient and makes an offering without him. And when Samuel sees what he did, he tells him how stupid that was, because God requires someone loyal and faithful. So Saul will have the kingdom taken away and given to someone not of his family line, but these things take time. And we also see in this passage the name of Saul's son, Jonathan, and he will turn out to be best friends with Saul's replacement. So what could go wrong? And because of Saul's foolishness, the Philistines had made sure that Israel had no blacksmiths to make weapons, so only Saul and Jonathan are left with any kind of weapon, with swords. So then we go down to 14 in verse 9. And we see there that God is still working behind the scenes, because Jonathan and his armor bearer sneak out and kill a Philistine garrison of 20 men. And because of that, God puts fear into the whole Philistine army, because they were, 20 of their men were taken down by 2 Israelites. And then down in verse 16, by the time Saul and the rest realize what happened, the Philistines have scattered and begun killing each other. We've seen this before with Gideon. And it's only then, of course, that the army of Israel is quote-unquote brave enough to attack them, when they're already on the run and half defeated at their own hands. And then down in verse 24, genuinely brave Jonathan, who didn't know about the fact that his father had made a foolish curse on anyone who ate any food before evening, because, motivation to finish the attack quickly, he comes across some honey and eats it. And he's revived, because nobody's had food all day, while the rest of the army is faint with hunger, so they all follow Jonathan's lead and quickly devour all the animals from the army they just plundered. But down in verse 32, Saul finds out about it. And though he waits until, he says, okay, everybody can eat, and yet when in time God refuses to answer him when he asks for a sign to go into battle, he wonders what's the matter. So in 1440, we see that he asked God to identify who this sinner was who's bringing this calamity on him, or in this case, silence. And Jonathan is outed. But the army he led to victory that day refuses to allow him to be executed. So Saul just goes back home to consolidate his reign by dealing with all the other enemies. And then he goes back to fighting the Philistines again. And in this, according to verse 48, he finally shows a little bit of bravery. So that's just what it says there. Okay, and then we'll go down to verse 49. And we're given the names of some of Saul's other children, including a daughter named, it's usually pronounced Michal, whatever. We'll say Michael, but it's her name. And a name to remember. She'll come up later in another lesson. But the Philistines, as mentioned in an earlier lesson, would continue to vex Israel during Saul's reign. And he was in the habit of conscripting any particularly brave man he saw. How he would identify brave men, I guess it would be pretty obvious for him, somebody who's not like him. But anyway, chapter 15, God said that the kingdom would be taken from Saul, and now we come to the events leading up to that. God tests Saul by ordering him to totally wipe out the Amalekites, but he spares the king and the best of the loot. So we see down here in verse 10, that God tells Samuel of his regret at choosing Saul, and Samuel confronts Saul over his failure to obey God. Saul makes excuses and denies it, and denies it and denies it, and then down in verse 21, we see that Samuel isn't buying it, and this is where we find the familiar passage about God valuing obedience more than sacrifice. And finally, Saul admits his guilt and his motive, which was fear, and this time of his own army. So his bravery was pretty short-lived. And in verse 29, let me roll that down a little bit, we see that there's another characteristic of God. He is not a human being, which most translations render man. God is not a man. This is important to remember whenever other religions try to make God in their image, or when Christians try to adopt heathen beliefs by making God gendered. So there's implications for this statement that God makes about his own character. Then we'll go down to verse 32. And it would turn out to be Samuel, not Saul, who dispatches the Amalekite king in obedience to God. And Saul would, from this point, never see Samuel again. But the repetition of the statement about God regretting his choice of Saul is a curious thing, since we all agree that God is all-knowing, and he had just said he doesn't change his mind like people do. We also recall God's regretting he made mankind at all and the subsequent flood. You can read a fairly extensive or exhaustive list of God's apparent regrets at the link in the description in the final post on that page. A possible answer from one angle is that God is saying this for our benefit and in terms we can grasp. His purpose is to emphasize that his decision is final, and also for us to learn from other people's mistakes. And the lesson here is not just for Israel. How often has Christianity chosen the most attractive, charismatic, eloquent leaders instead of the most godly or studied in the Word? Look at the popular so-called ministries on or offline and see what they're teaching, because we don't learn these lessons. But another angle is that the word typically rendered regret is better understood as grief. Yet why would God only be grieved after the passage of time, since it was his choice and he knew how it would turn out? Certainly the free will he granted humanity comes into play, but in these and numerous other passages, we're given the impression that God is disappointed that people miss his expectations, which shouldn't be the case since he knew what they would do from the start. So in studying this, we can see, at least in the Greek, the word here in verse 35 is melithi, whereas in verse 29 it was metanoisi, which is metanoia is a word we're more familiar with in the New Testament. So let me put verse 29 up there as well so you can see both of those, 29 and 35. They're two different words, similar in meaning, and what I've been able to determine is that the primary difference between the two is that while that's verse 29, the first one, is just a change of mind or direction, but the one in 35 includes the motivation for such a change. And remember as well that the semantic range of any word, that is, all its possible meanings, is taken from all the contexts in which it's found, not the other way around. The context is not determined by something we can pick out of the word's semantic range. So we can at least establish that God is not repenting of a sin or mistake, just to make that point. And if you don't know what semantic range is, let me just chase that rabbit trail for a second. It's like the English word trunk. What does that mean? It can mean an elephant's nose. It can mean a box where you keep clothing typically and has a lid with locks on it. It can mean the base of a tree. It can mean a person's torso. It can mean male swimwear. It can mean the back end of a car, at least in the U.S. So those are very different meanings for the same exact word, pronounced the same, spelled the same, and it all depends on context. But what you cannot do with the word trunk is import the meaning whatever you want it to be and ignore the context or make the context bend to fit it. But that's what people do with the Bible. And with these words meaning repent or regret and their semantic range. You have to be careful with that. Context is everything. And then because of the context, wherever we learn anything about God, we know that God is not sinful. There is no sin in him. He is the definition of not sin. And he doesn't make mistakes. So how do we reconcile verses 29 and 35? In my opinion, the solution is that while God never changes his plans, he often changes our instructions at various points in time. This is the outworking of a paradox between his sovereignty and our free will, a paradox that Calvinism does not understand. For example, when God came down to see what the builders of the Tower of Babel were up to, or when Abraham would obey God, whether Abraham would obey God without question in being told to sacrifice his son Isaac, we can see in these visitations that they're from our perspective and our ability to understand, not God's limitations or imperfections. And this is really the essence of dispensationalism as a hermeneutic or method of interpretation. That God himself and his nature and his plans cannot change, but his dealings with us change all the time because free will. In the next lesson, we will pick up with the narrative where David will be anointed as king.